Petrucci Giuseppe, Baldelli Carlo, Baldoni Virginia, Olini Santi.
That's what it sounded like in the Italian town of Gubbio just a few days ago. It's about 3 hours north of Rome. And what you're hearing is the reciting of the names of 40 victims of one of the worst mass executions to take place in Italy during the Second World War. This solemn ceremony marked the 80th anniversary of the Gubbio massacre, when 40 Italian men, teenagers, and a mother and daughter, all civilians, on June 22nd, 1944, were rounded up by the Nazis, forced to dig a mass grave, and then shot against a wall in the town. It was payback for a partisan attack earlier in the week by the resistance. Gunmen had come down from the hills around Gubbio and killed a German officer and wounded a second soldier while the pair was drinking coffee at a Gubbio bar. During the Second World War, after the Canadians, Americans, and Brits liberated the southern part of Italy in 1943, the Germans invaded and occupied mainland Italy, and they held on until the end of the war in 1945. Now, the story of the Gubbio massacre and whether justice was properly done after the war hasn't really had any Canadian connections. And in fact, none of the 40 victims was Jewish, although the Germans did execute 3 Jews in Gubbio earlier that year. But the Toronto criminal lawyer Robert Rotenberg, who's also a best-selling author and normally writes thrillers with rip-from-the-headlines cases from his native city, was captivated by the story of the tragedy of Gubbio, which he first heard about while on a holiday. So he made it the international backdrop for his newest book. It's called What We Buried. It's the 7th in his crime series about a fictional Toronto Jewish detective and his non-Jewish colleagues, mixing them into the true massacre story. The book is about the past, about the rise of fascism, its impact on Italy's Jews and on others, about family secrets, and how Canada let Nazi war criminals enter our country all those decades ago.
It's like all history. If we don't face it, we're condemned to relive it.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Thursday, June 27th, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News.
I can't date women right now because I'm too busy calling myself a piece of shit.
I had a dysfunctional Jewish mother and I had a dysfunctional Native mother.
I had 25 full years of utter struggle and failure.
I started to realize the absurdity of my inability to let go of this monster of guilt.
Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Hi, I'm Ralph Ben-Rig. I'm the host of Not That Kind of Rabbi, where we look at people's spiritual journeys and take a little time for their self-reflection, and maybe yours. You can get it all at the cjn.ca/NTKR or wherever you get your podcasts.
Robert Rotenberg first introduced the world to his fictional police hero Ari Green 15 years ago. And 6 books later, he's used modern-day Canadian issues like the homeless problem in Toronto's ravines or a hotly contested race for mayor as his themes. But with his new book, What We Buried, Rotenberg broadened his canvas. He went back in time, weaving in the Holocaust, Italian history, and a cold case murder in the Muskokas north of the city, while all the while mindful that his latest book might do more than just entertain readers, but could also serve as a non-threatening way to highlight a dark period in the history of both Italy and Canada. Rotenberg and I sat down for an interview recently in front of a live audience at the University of Toronto's Innis College Auditorium, where Rotenberg launched his new book. And full disclosure, I helped him edit the book since I lived in Italy for many years working as a foreign correspondent, and I also wrote my own book about the 17,000 Canadian Jews who served in uniform in the Second World War, especially in Italy. Rotenberg kindly asked me to MC this Canadian book launch. Welcome, everybody. Before we get started, we have a little presentation about the book.
We produced a short video, and I think we're going to play that first.
Yes, first.
In the year 2000, when my now 24-year-old daughter was a baby, we went to Italy for a few weeks. One day we ended up in Gubbio, a perfectly preserved, rather remote medieval hill town in Umbria. That afternoon, we watched the 500-year-old crossbow contest held in one of the most magnificent squares in all of Europe, complete with flag wavers, trumpeters, and costume competitors. We loved it. and after we walked through the town's narrow streets, packed with families serving wonderful Italian food late into the night. At that point, I had not even started writing my novels, but I knew in my heart that one day I had to include this spectacle in a book. When I began my first book, Old City Hall, I gave one of my main characters, Daniel Kennicott, a backstory that I knew would lead him back to Gubbio. Here's the book, and right out at the beginning, page 9, this is what I wrote as his backstory. It had been 3.5 years since Daniel Kennicott had joined the police force, turning his back on what had been a promising career as a young lawyer in one of the city's top firms. The reason? His older brother Michael had been murdered 12 months before. When the investigation seemed to be going nowhere, he traded in his legal robes for a badge. It took me 3 years to write my new novel. This is it, What We Buried. Along the way, I discovered the tragic key to the mystery. In June 1944, when Germany occupied Italy, and one afternoon Italian partisans killed a Nazi officer and injured another. As revenge, Hitler demanded the murder of 40 innocent civilians. This horror became the spine of the novel. I'm not the child of Holocaust survivors, but as readers of my novels will know, my main character, Ari Green, is. So are many of my closest friends. For years, I've talked to their survivor parents and collected their stories. To research this novel, I read every book I could get my hands on about Italy during and after the war. Like many Holocaust survivors, Ari's father, Yitzhak, a favorite of many of my readers, has never told anyone about what he did after the war. At last, in this novel, he sits down with his beloved granddaughter, the young journalist Allison Green, and she videotapes his story. Pulling these 3 disparate stories together, bringing back characters from earlier books, and creating a host of new ones made this the most difficult book to write of any of my novels, and the most rewarding.
So I've had the privilege of you allowing me to read an advanced reader's copy because we have many connections in common. My first honeymoon was in Gubbio. I wrote this book about the Italian campaign and the Canadians who served in the Second World War. I speak fluent Italian. I caught some really bad typos in your index.
Thank God.
Really bad about the martyrs' names that were all gremlins. I don't know how those names came up. There was like AI put their names in. Oh my God, that would have been horrible. But I really wanted to ask you, this year is the 80th anniversary, 2024. So it's like a rip from the headlines anniversary. Was this a plan that it was going to come out just this year?
No, actually, what I said in the video is absolutely true. Is I created this idea because I just love the idea of opening a book, which this book opens with the crossbow contest, and I had no idea. We were at Gubbio years ago. I didn't even know about the massacre, and when I started researching and I found out about the massacre, it was just so compelling.
But another story that is ripped from the headlines now is something relevant that many of you will remember. In the fall, the Canadian government in Parliament gave a standing ovation to an SS Ukrainian Nazi soldier who then came to Canada legally, and now the government gave him a standing ovation until they found out, oh, there's Nazi war criminals here? Really? We didn't know. And then you all remember the story, which was an incredible, it was before October 7th, so at the time it was the biggest story of the year. Do you feel that it's worth it, even all these years later, to tell these stories and find out and unearth the real Nazi war criminals as opposed to the fictional one in your book?
Well, I think what I found so exciting about writing this book is my first 6 books were about Toronto, like a fictional Toronto, but about what was really happening in the city. Downfall was about homelessness. Stray Bullets was about the rise of gun violence. A book called Stranglehold about a crazy mayor, and 10 days later, Ford went crazy. So I've always tried to look ahead, but in this book, putting my fictional characters into real history, it's a real stretch for me, and I love doing it, and it's actually where I want to take my writing, because I think it just adds so much depth and meaning. And what was very interesting when I went to Italy is, because I spoke to a lot of people in Gubbio, and it's like everything, there's a lot of gray, because at first you think it's great that these the partisans killed a Nazi and injured another one, but then you realize the town is kind of divided, because half the people are thinking, well, the Germans were going to be gone soon, and we lost 40 of our people. So there's always, it's never quite black and white, and I think that's where novelists live. That's in the conflict and the interest. So I'm not really answering your question.
No, I was going to say, but back to my question.
Yeah.
How important is it, even if it's in a historical fiction novel, but even so, for a country this far away from the war to have a reckoning with its actual past of letting in people like the grandfather? Spoiler alert.
And I don't want to spoil the book, but you can see that that's
I just did.
the crucial part of a real part of the book, which I'm going to kind of leave it at that. And I think it's important. And what's interesting about books and stories about World War II, which, as my great friend Robert Rotenberg said, once you get into it, it's endless, especially the Holocaust. It's almost like there's a tertiary interest. I mean, at first people were interested in D-Day and the battles and the Holocaust, but now people are almost interested in like the day-to-day and what actually was life like then and now. It's like all history. If we don't face it, we're condemned to relive it.
Speaking of what you just mentioned, though, in Italy, where many of you may not know, yes, Mussolini enforced the racial laws, as you learned, but that the clergy and many other ordinary Italians hid the Jews. They protected the Jews. Yes, there were several thousand who were deported from Rome and elsewhere. They even have a crematorium and a death camp in Italy, in Trieste, which I've been to. But the actual legacy of what the Italians did for the Jews hasn't really been told. And I wonder how moving that was for you to discover this.
Here are some of the photos I took of the Gubbio Crossbow Museum, the current crossbow champion, the compelling shrine to the 40 martyrs, and most remarkable of all, a 94-year-old priest who, at horrible risk to himself, because the Nazis didn't just murder priests who assisted Jews, they tortured them to death, hid a Jewish family from Florence in his monastery.
Well, to meet this priest was one of the most extraordinary things, and I wanted a guide to take me around Gubbio, and every guide just wanted to show me all the history from 300-400 years. It's fascinating history. So we found this guide, and I told her what I wanted to do, and she's a lovely young woman. She said, well, we don't do that. And then the next day she came and she said, oh my God, this is amazing. And she found the priest, and it was like I watched her rediscover her history, which was wonderful. She thanked me for it at the end. So I've heard just extraordinary stories of bravery of the Italians. Most people don't know, like I like to say to people, here's a quiz. When was Rome liberated? What day was Rome liberated? You know, but what else? Who else knows? Well, it's almost sad no one knows, because it was June the 4th, 1944. And how do we know that? Because June the 6th, 1944 was D-Day. And the soldiers who'd fought all the way up the Italian boot, including the Canadians, and you can see how I went to put the Canadians in the book, they had fought all through Africa, they'd fought all through the war, and they thought, like, what's this big deal? These men fought one battle. We fought the whole thing. So,
right, and only 350 were killed that day, right. Whereas in the Italian campaign, 92,000 Canadians served, 6,000 lay buried in graves across Italy. It was a muddy, brutal war of attrition. Canadians won lots of Victoria Crosses for liberating Ortona. I've tried so hard, Bob, but I'm sure the Canadians were not in Gubbio. They were farther west. I was wishing, please, be for real. I checked again last night. They were not.
No. The great Canadian battle was in Ortona in Christmas of My son Peter, who knows a lot of history, is nodding. In 1943, Farley Mode was there. So you'll see in the book, I found a way to give a character that story, and that was what's so exciting about writing this book, is using the history and real characters. Well, I guess they weren't real, but they were real to me.
Well, they are. You have to have, the names are changed, but I want to bring up your next project. People still have to read this one, but you're already working, as authors do, on the next one. Right. Talk to me about why you want to explore more Holocaust themes, and specifically where this one is going to be. Well,
that's actually a whole idea for another series. What's fascinating is the whole history of what happened after the war. I think I'll just leave it at that. And I'm really fascinated. There was a period, Germany wasn't a country for 3 years, and there were 1 million displaced people. There were 250,000 Jewish displaced people. And I want to say something special, which is many of my friends who are here, unlike me, they're children of Holocaust survivors. I had the real honor to talk to a lot of their parents, and including my friend Ron Davis's mother. So to be able to use actual things that they told me and stories in the book is a real honor.
I want to ask you one more thing that the audience may want to Google when they get home. If you read Italian or English, it's in some British papers. But many, many years after the war, the Italians who were the atrocities that was committed by the Germans to your people in Gubbio, but also to the 200-some, including Jews of Rome. It's called the Fosse Ardeatine, which they were taken out and shot in reprisal for the same kind of action against the SS in the streets of Rome. If any of you have been to Rome and you've been on a Jewish tour, they do take you there. And there's many, many more of these. Gubbio wasn't alone.
No.
There was 700 killed in the mountains, and there's a movement. Can you just tell us what's going on with compensation now, not from Germany anymore, because they're done paying, but from Italy?
Yeah, one of the frustrations when you research this is that there was never any of the German soldiers who were involved in this were ever deported to Italy. And much of the frustration of people, and in fact, part of the research I did, I must have watched 50 YouTube videos, and at one point I stumbled on a video of the grandson of one of the German soldiers who'd been part of the massacre came to Gubbio, and which has been a real theme. A lot of young Germans are trying to do that. And he came to Gubbio, and there were 2 survivors, young children who saw their parents dragged out of their homes. And one of them met him, and eventually they shook hands. The woman just said she couldn't meet him. And you can see that's reflected in the book. So the scars are very, very deep. And so it was very exciting to suddenly see this headline that at last the Italian government was starting to you emailed me, you said, hey, how did you know this was going to happen?
The sad thing is that there were 22,000 victims of Nazi atrocities in Italy, including 8,000 Jews. The government is now cutting off the compensation fund. As of last June, if you hadn't gotten it in already, you're done. They're done paying, it's move on. And so they've only gotten 1,280 claims in, and there's only 61 million euros. It's not a lot. We'll see what happens, whether it gets expanded, but the families are still hurting and still traumatized, even though it's 80 years. And I wonder, do you know what's going to happen in Gubbio this coming June? Is there some kind of bigger memorial plan because it's such a milestone?
I don't know, but what I do know is that every year in June, they told me the city shuts down and the school children go there. We tend to think the past is the past, but as Faulkner said, the past is not the past. It's here with us all the time. So, and it was fascinating being able to kind of bring that and the Canadian story together. That's what I think made this such a joy to write this book, as painful as it was over 3 years.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounded like for this episode of the CJN Daily. I've put the link in our show notes to learn more and to let you watch the entire interview and book launch. It's on YouTube. Meanwhile, the elderly Italian priest who figures in the book, Don Ubaldo Braccini, whose family did help hide Jews in Gubbio during the war, right in their church, recently died in October. 40,000 of the 50,000 Italian Jews during the war survived. Here at home in Canada, after the war, Canada did allow in thousands of former German and Nazi soldiers, including some from Ukraine and other Axis countries who had collaborated with the Nazis. A royal commission in the 1980s learned the names and the locations of these Nazi personnel. The RCMP held on to these secret files too. The Canadian government prosecuted very few of them successfully. Meanwhile, B'nai B'rith and other Jewish organizations have been lobbying for decades to have these documents made public. Our show is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman. The executive producer is Michael Freeman, and our music is by Dov Beck-Levine. Thanks for listening to the CJN Daily.
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Zach Hyman, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest-running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.